All right, we're going to try to do something pretty ambitious here. Condense 2,000 years of Cambodian history, from its most epic heights to its most tragic depths. We're drawing from David Chandler's incredible book to really understand how this magnificent civilization was born and how it was almost completely destroyed.
So let's start with a really big question. Just look at this. This is Angkor, a true marvel of human engineering and devotion. How did the Khmer people, the civilization that raised these breathtaking temples to the heavens, later find themselves enduring a literal hell on earth? To even begin to answer that, we have to go way back.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. We're going to break this huge story down into 6 chapters. We'll start with the earliest foundations and the glorious Angkorian Empire, then move through a period of huge change into the chaos of the 20th century, the horror of the Khmer Rouge, and finally, look at where the nation stands today.
So let's dive right into Chapter 1, from Funan to Angkor. This is where the very foundations of Khmer civilization were put into place. Now, a revolutionary change swept through this whole region, a process called Indianization. And what's so fascinating about this is that it wasn't a conquest. No Indian armies ever showed up. Instead, early Cambodians actively chose and adapted parts of Indian culture, their writing, their religions, their ideas about what makes a king, and they blended all of it with their own local traditions to create something totally new and unique.
And this is a really key point, a major pivot in this story. The earliest states, places like Funan, they were all about trade. They were coastal, they were outward-looking. But by the 8th century, the whole center of power moves inland. These new kingdoms, known as Chenla, were built on something completely different: control over people and the ability to grow massive amounts of rice. And that, right there, set the stage for a true empire.
Which, of course, leads us straight into Chapter 2, the Age of God Kings and the 600-year-long glory of the Angkorian Empire. This is the Cambodia that most of us picture. So, how did you become a God King? Well, it turns out there is this brilliant, kind of 3-step formula for absolute power. First, you had to master nature. You'd do this by building enormous reservoirs, proving you could bring water and life to the kingdom. Second, you'd honor your ancestors by building temples and basically turning them into gods. And third, the final step, you construct a massive, personal temple mountain, a replica of the mythical home of the gods, with you, the king, right at the center of it all.
And here, this is the perfect example of that final step. You're looking at the Bayon, the temple mountain of King Jehoram VII. Those hundreds of serene, smiling faces carved into the towers, they're believed to be a fusion of the king himself and the Buddha, just radiating this divine power and compassion over the entire kingdom. It's incredible.
You know the engine driving this whole empire? It was water. They had this unbelievably sophisticated system of canals and reservoirs that allowed for 2, sometimes even 3 rice harvests a year. That's how they fed such a huge population. The state taxed pretty much everything you can imagine, but get this, they never used money. The entire economy, the whole shebang, ran on rice, goods, and the forced labor of its people.
Now, after Angkor's peak, you get this period that a lot of people just write off as the decline. But as we get into Chapter 3, we're going to see it wasn't a simple decline at all. It was actually a time of deep, fundamental transformation.
I mean, just look at the difference. It's night and day. The religion completely shifts from Hinduism to Theravada Buddhism. The capital itself moves from way up north at Angkor down south to the river trading hub of Phnom Penh. And of course, power follows the money, shifting from this old priestly class who controlled the land to a new elite who were all about foreign trade. The country was basically reinventing itself.
This era of change was also shaped by huge pressure from the outside. So you see Angkorian art, and it projects this image of unshakable, divine power, right? But this carving shows the reality: constant, brutal warfare. And as the empire's whole internal structure was changing, it just became more and more vulnerable to its powerful neighbors.
And this right here, this quote from Chandler, it just nails the dilemma that would trap Cambodia for the next 500 years. It was literally stuck between a rock and a hard place. With 2 rising powers, Siam to the west and Vietnam to the east, it forced Cambodia's leaders into this never-ending, dangerous balancing act.
All right, buckle up. Chapter 4 throws us into the dizzying, rapid-fire changes of the 20th century. We're talking about an era of French colonialism and the messy struggle for independence that followed.
And wow, does the pace pick up here? It's like a tragic domino effect. France sets up a protectorate in 1863. Nationalism really starts to catch fire during World War II. They get full independence in 1953. But that's followed by a coup in 1970 that throws the country into civil war and paves the way for the Khmer Rouge to march into the capital in 1975.
But it's so important to remember this. Right before the absolute worst of it, there was this brief window of hope. The years under Prince Sihanouk after independence, many Cambodians who lived through it remember that time as a golden age, a moment of peace, vibrant culture, and real optimism. And that makes the horror that came next even more shocking. And now, we have to turn to Chapter 5, to the darkest chapter in Cambodia's entire 2,000-year history, the Khmer Rouge Cataclysm.
The day was April 17, 1975. The Khmer Rouge march into power and they declare year zero. Just think about what that means. They wanted to literally erase history, erase society itself. In an instant, money, markets, schools, religion, private property, it was all gone, abolished overnight in this radical, brutal attempt to create some kind of pure agrarian utopia.
So what did that look like? The cities were emptied, literally emptied. Millions of people, doctors, teachers, artists, monks, really anyone with an education, were marched out into the countryside and forced to become farm laborers. The entire country was turned into one massive, militarized labor camp. And the result was genocide. In less than 4 years, the regime's fanatical policies led to the deaths of nearly 2 million people. 1 in 4. Let that sink in. 1 out of every 4 Cambodians was gone. So, how does the country even begin to come back from that? That brings us to our final chapter, Cambodia's fragile future and the long, painful process of trying to rebuild a nation that was completely shattered. Okay, so here's the whirlwind tour of what happened next. The Khmer Rouge are finally pushed out by a Vietnamese invasion in '79. That's followed by a decade of civil war, a massive UN peacekeeping mission in the early 90s, the final collapse of the Khmer Rouge movement itself, and then Cambodia's slow, cautious re-entry into the region and the world.
But here's the final, crucial question that Chandler leaves us with. The very traits that helped Cambodians survive centuries of chaos, this deep, inward-looking focus on family and tradition, now pose a huge question for the future. Can the skills that helped you survive be transformed into the skills you need to actually flourish?
When you think about it, from the God Kings of Angkor to the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia's story is this incredible, almost unbelievable cycle of creation and destruction. And after 2 millennia, that story is nowhere near finished. In fact, its greatest challenge, figuring out what comes next, is really just beginning.